what James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian and Helen Pluckrose were able to show when they had the grievance studies affair some years ago, and were able to get numerous papers accepted for publication that were total hoax. When things like that happen and it's not taken seriously, that you do actually need to test and try these ideas and be defending them and all that kind of stuff, that really does tend to cause a problem in science. And this is why I get worried about activism in science. This will be a brief video because I'm saving a little bit, something a little bit longer for later this week, because I'm playing with the data. Well, not playing with, that's not the right word. Analyzing some of the data from the Heterodox Academy Campus Expression Survey, just out of my curiosity, and noticed some interesting things. So I'm going to talk about that hopefully later this week, when I get that done. So that should be interesting. So keep an eye out for that. But I wanted to revisit something because I mentioned this a couple of times, both with nature and their royally stupid decision to continue after being shown it doesn't end well. They chose, they're going to say, oh yeah, we're going to make endorsements again, despite the fact that it was shown actually in a study that that doesn't work for them. And the other article last week in the Heterodox Academy blog with the professors there who were talking about how partisan science is bad for politics. Indeed. So I wanted to make a point of just showing a brief overview and some of the topics and thoughts, because that whole argument about how involved scientists should get in political advocacy, or in just advocacy generally for a particular approach to things or particular politician or anything like that, goes back quite a long time. It is a long, long, long piece in the literature. And so there's interesting questions there to look at, and I wanted to just give a breadth of it. And part of it is because, unfortunately, where I am, I don't have access behind the paywalls for some of these for some of these articles, or there would be some interesting things to read in here. But like this one is from January 2001. It appeared in Human Dimensions of Wildlife. Science and advocacy are different, and we need to keep them that way. Written by Larry Nielsen, I believe. Because of my administrative role and personality, I am very suspicious of mixing science and advocacy. Science is concerned with being right, whereas advocacy is concerned with not being passive. Now, what does he mean by that? Science is concerned with the pursuit of the truth, what is objectively real. Advocacy is, of course, not necessarily. It is concerned with getting a particular agenda through politically or what have you. Two big differences. You could put activism in the advocacy camp here. Consequently, science by itself can seldom prescribe social decisions. Exactly. Science doesn't prescribe a social decision. Indeed. This kind of commentary goes back to the arguments. You know, I've seen Nature and Scientific American and what have you say, oh my God, how awful the Supreme Court is when they're ignoring science, they're anti-science and all this kind of thing. It's like, wait a minute. Pause there. What's the role of science? What's the role of the court? Those are two different things. Same kind of thing here. The role of science in this isn't to prescribe social decisions. It's to get at the truth. Really all it is. This assures that when scientists advocate, they will go beyond the limits of they will generally go beyond the limits of their scientific knowledge. Because scientists and professionals, just like all people, are laden with values, they need to be especially cautious and self-conscious when they act as advocates. And because natural resource scientists and professionals often work in areas where knowledge is scarce and decisions are important across society, we have special responsibilities to be explicit about our roles as advocates. We must study and minimize our biases, clearly understand our personal values, disclose our interests, and seek and embrace contrary views, and regularly assess our motives. Now, what is all that going on there? Jonathan Rauch talks about this in depth in The Constitution of Knowledge, which, if you haven't read the book, I do encourage you to read it. It's a very good book. But a single scientist, no scientist would say they don't have values and they don't have a bias in one particular direction or another. But the point of the whole system, the whole constitution of knowledge on the science side, in particular, but also in general liberal Western philosophies, is that you open it up to error checking by others who may have a different bias from your own and likely do. And as a result, with those competing things, you end up getting at what something really is, and you hopefully do address any issues. That's what he's getting at here, is the recognition that, yeah, scientists are people. It's not like we don't have our biases and preferences for things, whether it be in our study or in the other vein of things. What do we... Well, in the other vein of things that we would prefer to see happen in society ourselves. The trick is, of course, what we're supposed to catch with peer review and with all those other kinds of things is the notion of, counteract each other's biases, correct things that go wrong, logical checks for logical fallacies and all those kinds of things. The problem you can run into, of course, is that depends upon there being people of very different backgrounds and ways of thinking about things and the like in sciences or in a particular field of science. Otherwise, you do get things that all come from a particular direction and the biases are not checked. See grievance studies, all for that matter. Yeah, the grievance studies articles are a very good example of that for the most part. But it goes on further because you can see even more debates over, what is responsible advocacy in science good advice? Debates over scientists' appropriate contributions to policymaking are prominent in a variety of natural resource fields. The issue is often presented as one of responsible advocacy, but this framing locks us into a paradox. Scientists who advocate aim to be effective in the policy area, but by advocating lose their credibility. In this preliminary review of the issue, I argue that we can avoid the paradox by acknowledging a wider range of speech acts structuring scientists' obligations in the policy process. Scientists can advocate, but they can also report, give their assessments, make recommendations, and especially offer good advice. And this is a difference, because nobody necessarily, I don't even have a problem with a scientist, doing things with a politician. If what you're doing is giving an assessment or making a recommendation or giving a good advice, but advocating for a specific policy as under your professional capacity as a scientist, that's where it starts to get quite murky and you end up running into the activism kind of thing very, very easily. So that was 2012. And the reason I point this out is these are all articles that have cited this one here. Comparing student and professional responses toward advocacy in science. Groups disagree. Okay. To advance the conversation about scientists' roles in advocacy, we conducted an exploratory study examining the perspectives of students alongside those of academic faculty and other natural resource professionals. We surveyed wildlife and natural resource students and professionals, mostly in the southeastern United States, and found areas of agreement and contention that can be used for promoting communication across groups engaged in science and policy. Groups disagreed about what actions constituted advocacy and what roles are acceptable for scientists, but groups agreed scientists should engage in advocacy to influence policy. Now, this is one thing where I'm going to say, just because students say that doesn't make it a good thing to do. That's just one note I want to make there in that point. The majority of respondents lacked previous formal training about these topics. Given growing support for closer relationships between science and advocacy seen in this and other published works, our findings suggest that educational opportunities be made available to emerging and established scientists. Opportunities should foster a deeper understanding of the science advocacy nexus and aid in making informed decisions about the appropriate role of scientists. This is... I get nervous. I get nervous with this because, I mean, you are, for all practical purposes, pushing scientists into an advocacy position, and yeah, I'm not a fan, to be honest. I get really, really nervous. It's very different things with this, because what you're doing on your personal time, I don't care what you're advocating for in your personal time. It's a question of whether or not you're doing it in your professional capacity at the same time, and you're advocating for a specific policy. Let's see. On advocacy by environmental scientists, whether to what, whether, why, and how. Journal of the Society of Conservation Biology. Debate about the nature and appropriateness of advocacy by environmental scientists is important. It represents understanding the role of these citizens in our society. Much has been written about advocacy by scientists, and that literature describes substantial diversity in reasons why advocacy by scientists is or is not appropriate. Despite the nature of this literature, there has been no comprehensive systematic review of why some favor and others oppose advocacy by environmental scientists. Through a literature review, we cataloged, categorized, and critiqued the arguments used for and against the appropriateness of advocacy by environmental scientists. Most arguments, whether for or against advocacy, are characterized by some significant deficiency. From our analysis of the literature, an argument emerges that to date has never been fully articulated, that advocacy is nearly unavoidable, and that scientists, by virtue of being citizens first and scientists second, have a responsibility to advocate to the best of their abilities to improve their advocacy abilities, and to advocate in a justified and transparent manner. We also discuss the meaning and relevance of advocacy being justified and transparent. We suggest scientists expend their efforts to better understand what constitutes appropriate advocacy and spend less effort pondering whether or not they should advocate. So, okay. One of the things I would make a point about with this is that, what he's talking about, or what they are talking about, and I think there might be more than one author. Yeah, what they are talking about is a spectrum of what scientists communicate about. And what do I mean by that? What you could be advocating for, to borrow their language, is to say, hey, you're using this tool that was developed for this wrong. Let me show you why. Let me show you why, and also let me show you how to use it appropriately. Or that's an incorrect physical understanding. Here's what it correctly is. There's a difference then when you're talking about advocacy in the political sense and pushing for a particular political thing, or pushing things that support your particular view. That's a difference here. And again, I get really, really nervous. If you haven't been able to figure it out, I tend to line up for scientists who, in their professional capacity, should not be advocates for particular policy. And it's in part because of the argument that the Nature article, the Nature Human Behavior article, pointed out, in that you damage your credibility doing that. So that's one of the reasons I want to mention that. Let's see. Models of science and society transcending the antagonism, humanities and social science communications. What is the appropriate place for science and society? Despite the vast literature on the subject, the science-society relation remains a disputed issue. This is 2022, so we've gone from 2001 to 2022. A major reason is that when we are asking about the right place of science and society, we are asking a range of interrelated and hard-to-answer individual questions. These questions include the role of social values in the research process, the neutrality of science and policy, the interplay between evidence and decision making, and many others. A, new, a sensible way to organize these questions and the set of potential answers are science society interaction models. So this guy decided to make a model of the question. Sometimes I like that. Sims reduce the complexity of the science society relation and provide generic templates for interactions between scientists and non-scientists. However, Sims are often used in an unproductive way, namely as antagonistic camps or as representations of real-world actors' beliefs. Focusing on the popular distinction between technocratic, decisionist, and pragmatist models, this paper discusses the strengths and weaknesses of Sims. It argues that Sims should not, as often done in the science society literature, be understood as antagonistic camps or representation of actor beliefs, but as ideal types and heuristics. Building on this interpretation, this paper presents tentative ideas for a reflexive tool that real-world actors can use to assess their fundamental assumptions about science and society. So interesting things like that show up in here. And that's not the only one. The article itself, because it was 2001, references things that are also in that vein. So you've got 1996, Science for Survival, Values and Conservation Biology, Maintaining Consistency Between Self-Serving Beliefs and Available Data from Psychology, 1985, Biased Assimilation, Attitude Polarization, and Effect in Reactions to Stereotype-Relevant Scientific Information, 1997, Psychology. Being a scientist means taking sides. I started reading part of this early. Part of it was available. I kind of disagree with that one. Let's see. When does intellectual passion become a conflict of interest? Confusion on the cutting edge. This is actually in Science. Not very well cited, actually, for being in Science. So yeah, understanding impediments to diversity in agriculture education. Hello. 1994 Agricultural Education Magazine. Yep. Ethics and Scientific Judgments in Management. Beware of Blurred Distinction. Wildlife Society Bulletin, 1991. Recognizing and Resolving Conflicts of Interest. Advocacy for Fisheries Professionals. Ethics of Rural Sociology, 1986. So these are just references from this one thing. Of course, if I were to go back and look at other articles or other references for articles and go to some of these older things, you'd find it going back even further. As for me, what I have said and what I continue to maintain is that I do not think it's necessarily a good thing for scientists themselves to get involved in activism. And I unfortunately have seen that creep in the sense of the social justice stuff, or critical social justice, more or less, the, more appropriately to say anyway, postmodernism, the colloquial woke, if you will. I've seen a lot more activism creep in and gotten into arguments with folks about it, oftentimes using the disparity fallacy or saying, well, no, it's primarily this and it can't be much other things. Those kinds of arguments have come up quite frequently. But I think when you do that and you start getting into activism, one of the ways Jonathan Rauch described the process of the constitution of knowledge, science just generally, what have you, I think is a useful metaphor. He described it as a funnel. At the top, it's wide open, right? Any ideas come pouring in. From the crazy to the normal to the wildly out there, anything like that. And into that funnel come all these ideas, and when you go down into the middle there, to that narrow tip at the end, what's happening is all those ideas are getting tested. They're getting tried. They're getting ripped to shreds, and, folks are defending them. That whole process that we go through of vetting information, what have you, or that we're supposed to go through anyway, vetting information, doing all that other kind of stuff, whittles it down to the things that make it out at the end, that are the really good studies and the like. That's what you would hope, at any rate. My concern with activism is twofold. That one of two things would happen. That the filter goes onto the top of the funnel, not at the bottom. And in a filter such that only certain things can be studied in science. Now, this is precluding anything ethical related, all of the Belmont report and things like that. Obviously, things that go against the Belmont report and some established ethics standards that actually do make sense, yes, that's fine. Understandable so. But other things that don't, when you get into an activism stance, like narrow the funnel right at the top, you only get very little that comes in that way. The flip side of what I think could happen is that instead of that funnel being so narrow, broaden it out at the bottom, at the base, and you just let everything under the sun come through. That's actually more what I think is likely to happen, is that in the activism sense, you're just going to let well, actually, I think two things are going to happen. I think you're going to have the filter at the top, yes, for things that, go against an activist reasoning, if you will, for what should be allowed in a study. But you also have the other thing, well, if it makes it through the filter, as crazy and unrealistic and wild as it is, the filter at the top, it's going to make it through the funnel. And I think some of that has already happened when you see things like what James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian and Helen Pluckrose were able to show when they had the grievance studies affair some years ago, and were able to get numerous papers accepted for publication that were total hoax. When things like that happen and it's not taken seriously, that you do actually need to test and try these ideas and be defending them and all that kind of stuff, that really does tend to cause a problem in science. And this is why I get worried about activism in science. Why I get worried about the lack of viewpoint diversity. Or if there becomes a lack of viewpoint diversity, we could put it that way too. Because it will diminish the quality of scientific research, I think. You may filter out certain things that you don't want to hear about and let everything else go through just because. So I don't think activism belongs in science. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door. Comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that good jazz. And until next time, I'm Adrian. May you stay curious, everybody.